Can I tell them the story about yesterday?
Of course.
Or do you want to do the honor?
No, you do it. Absolutely. Go for it.
I got a very urgent message from him yesterday at 2:30 saying I cannot log into the seminar. Is the link broken? And I said, seminar's on Friday. To which he replied, I thought today was Friday.
My interpretation is that I was so excited that I couldn't wait for Friday to come. Right?
So it's my pleasure to introduce our very special guest for today, Marvin Lieberman, from the Anderson School of Management at University of California, Los Angeles, where Marvin serves a number of roles, including Professor of Strategy, the Harry and Elsa Kunin Chair in Business and Society. He also serves as the chairperson of the strategy area and as the Senior Associate Dean and Doctoral Program Director. He formerly was on the faculty at Stanford. He earned his PhD at Harvard in Business Economics. He is a fellow of the Strategic Management Society and is also the Media Innovations co-editor for SMS. He is a leading researcher on competitive strategy, market entry, first mover advantage, and value creation and value capture. He serves on the SMJ editorial board and formerly served as a guest associate editor for SMJ. He is a senior editor at Production and Operations Management. He, of course, is a publishing powerhouse, having published a whopping 15 articles in SMJ, 2 in AMR, 3 in the Rand Journal of Economics, and a whole bunch of others. And has accumulated over 15,000 citations. So please join me in welcoming Marvin Lieberman.
All right, Rich. Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I should start by saying, what a great innovation this pro seminar that you do has been, especially during this pandemic year. As you mentioned, I am a co-media innovations editor at SMS, and we don't give a prize for the best innovation in media innovations, but if we did, it would certainly go to you because
Thank you.
You've done a great service, well, to everyone, but I think especially to doctoral students and junior faculty during the pandemic year. It's very hard to get to meet people in person at conferences and the like. And you've succeeded beyond what I ever would have imagined, to be honest. When I look at the viewership and the professional quality and the fun element that you have in all of these, it's really been great. And I think it's helped for many doctoral students to get to know senior faculty, maybe even beyond what they would be able to do, certainly on some dimensions, well beyond what they could do just by coming up and chatting at a conference. So it is a great innovation, and it's, I really applaud you for it.
Well, thank you so very much for your extremely kind words. I really appreciate it. It has been a labor of love, and I've really enjoyed doing it. And I know, one of the reasons why I was looking forward to this particular interview is because I know that you have been such a fan of the Pro Seminar channel and series. You've mentioned to me several times how you listen to the interviews while cooking, and I'm glad that we're able to entertain you in the kitchen. I have been literally preparing for this all day today, and I will show you why in a moment here. This is why I've been preparing all day. I hope you guys can see the screen. It is because this is the first time we've had a pro seminar guest who has previously been on the Meet the Scholar series for the STR division. As you may know, Samina and I were kind of simultaneously on the same track of creating these two series on YouTube. And we didn't actually even know that the other was doing it until the first couple of videos started coming out. And we've managed to avoid having the same guests on both series, with one exception, which was Will Mitchell, who was our very first guest on this series. So when Will went on the Strategic Management Division's Meet the Scholar series, it was their problem how to differentiate the two videos. But this is the first time it's been my problem to figure out how to differentiate the two videos. Because that was a wonderful interview that Heather did with you. I really appreciated that. And I listened to it again this morning for the second time. And I really recommend it highly to anybody who's watching to definitely go and watch the video of this interview that Heather Berry did with Marvin. I guess probably about about 6 months ago. Because we learned so much about Marvin's background that I didn't know about before. For example, the high school startup that he was involved with to produce telemetry systems for model rockets, which incidentally played an indirect role in accelerating the development of the personal computer industry. Marvin's high school discussions with Herb Simon, where Herb Simon himself mentored Marvin toward the economics field, something I didn't know about at all. And in this interview with Heather, Marvin talked about his experiences at Harvard that directed him towards studying chemical industries, and he talked about his conversations with David Montgomery that led to the famous first mover advantage paper, and even talked about his experiences as a kind of an ad hoc turnaround consultant to a biotechnology startup. So there's a lot of interesting vignettes in that video, and I recommend it highly. They do these very long, even longer form interviews than I do, and they get down to asking, what's your favorite dessert and what's your favorite place to travel and that sort of thing. So if you want to know why Marvin loves strawberries, then I recommend watching that video, or for those in the UK, strawberries. So this is the first time we've had a guest on who was already interviewed on the Strategic Management Division series. So I've been working all day to try to figure out how to differentiate this interview and not replicate material that has already been covered in that interview with Heather for the STR division. So this is an episode where I basically have to throw out the regular script and have a new script. So I've got a whole bunch of different kinds of questions for Marvin. So thanks again for joining us. Let me start with one question that I usually do ask, right, in my interviews, but that I didn't hear Heather asking, which is, now, and perhaps especially now because you've been serving for a number of years as the doctoral program director for UCLA, and as the senior associate dean in that role. So you probably have to deal with a lot of doctoral students, not only within the strategic management field, but across all the fields: finance, accounting, operations, information systems, et cetera. What is, in this role, or in any mentoring role that you've been in with regard to doctoral students, what's the most important piece of advice that you give to doctoral students?
Good question. Yeah, and by the way, I feel like I spent a little too much time talking about my early life and development in that STR interview. It was kind of fun for me, but a lot of my journey was idiosyncratic. So, I'm happy to spend time here talking about things that are generally of value.
Exactly. That's my purpose. I mean, I just want to kind of clear all that away because you've already covered it. It's fascinating, but it's already been covered elsewhere.
Right. And especially for doctoral students who I think are probably the people who are watching these videos the most and have the most to benefit. I mean, for me, while I'm cooking, it's kind of fun to learn all these aspects of people's lives that I didn't know, for people that I think I know reasonably well. But I think for doctoral students, it can be especially helpful. So, in the doctoral student program generally, people are in all different areas. So there's a question of, there's no specific question that applies to everybody. I mean, finance is different from strategies, different from accounting, different from operations. But we've just been meeting, finally, we're able to meet in person. We're having a sequence of lunches at UCLA to tell each cohort, the special issues that arise in every year. That sort of the general advice to a doctoral student, I would say, based on my own experience, is to find phenomena that you're curious about and you're able to study, that whether it's strategy or other fields, you're going to spend an awful lot of time doing research on something, especially your dissertation topic is going to take at least the latter part of your time in the doctoral program and the early part of your years as a faculty member. So you better be really curious about the topic that you're studying. And you need to find, obviously, an angle that hasn't been studied before, and data that would allow you, assuming you're doing empirical work, data that would allow you to approach it effectively. I mean, I think one thing I didn't talk about in that, Academy of Management interview is, in my own case, I actually took a leave of absence from the doctoral program. I can't remember if I discussed this or not, and worked for a consulting firm, Charles River Associates. Mm-hmm. And during that time, I discovered that there was this trove of data on the chemical companies, especially capacity data. There's also industry pricing data. And so this set me on the course of basically connecting those very rich data with questions that were germane at the time. From industrial economics, game theory was really the rage, and there were all these models coming out of game theory, and some of them were inconsistent with each other in terms of predictions. And it seemed like a great opportunity to be able to test these models in the sense of figuring out which ones did seem to apply at least in particular contexts. So, I mean, another piece of advice is that, there's a lot of serendipity in this process. In my own case, I started off with the idea that I would look at strategic investment, which did turn out to be a topic that I pursued later. But as I began studying this, I noticed this very strong learning curve effect. I mean, it was much more powerful than anything else that I had been seeing, and it seemed like maybe I should really focus on this. Mm-hmm. And so that's what ended up being my dissertation. So anyway, in terms of advice to doctoral students, in general, I think it's just figure out a way to be curious, to focus, to collect the data you need. Another thing I often tell people is what's kind of unusual about our profession is that you've got to be able to function well for long periods of time just working by yourself, mm-hmm. In isolation. But to be effective, you also have got to have a social side. That means that at conferences and such, or presentations, you've got to be able to really connect with people. And I think it's a rare individual who is able to do both of those. I think most academics are basically introverts, but they have this extrovert side that they can turn on, at the right time. So that's kind of a piece of advice that I think often isn't provided, but I think when I see successful people in our field, they've obviously got both of those skills. And another thing that I advise our students about in strategy is that every strategy program is unique. That our students have a tendency to assume that other doctoral programs or other strategy programs are similar to UCLA.
Right.
And they often make mistakes when they go out in the job market. For example, we've got, many of our faculty really emphasize strong identification, empirical statistical identification. And so our students often go in the job market assuming that they're going to get lots of questions about identification and, how do they defend the identification strategy? And when they go on the job market, they find they typically get relatively few of those questions. They get more questions about how does your work connect to other streams of research and strategy. And the questions often, are based on what are the dominant views of people in that institution. So, I mean, if you look at schools, I just came back from Wharton, where lots of people are doing organizational learning.
Right.
Lots of people are doing corporate strategy. We have nobody at UCLA effectively doing those. I mean, I still do a little bit on learning curves, but other people, Dan Leventhal, for example, has really run with organizational learning in a broad sense. Linda Argoti at Carnegie Mellon has promoted learning curves. But anyway, those are just some of the pieces of advice that I would give students in general and also specifically in our strategy program.
Right. I think there's 2 points that I'll highlight out of what you said. One is, the balkanized nature of the strategy field, and that is that, the strategy field consists of these little enclaves of, of people doing work in a little silo that connects sometimes in some ways to what's going on in some other silos, but we do tend to live in these silos. And it's important for doctoral students to learn how to communicate across those silo boundaries, right? So if you're coming out of, Purdue or UCLA or Wharton, and you're interviewing for a job, say at Arizona State, where, a big part of the focus is on corporate governance, you need to know how to speak the language of corporate governance and how to make your research interesting and appealing to people who live, eat, breathe corporate governance 24/7. So, I think that is an important lesson, particular for the strategy field. I agree. Other fields are not necessarily like that. Other fields may have more of a central paradigm to them, right? So if I'm coming at an economics program, yes, economics programs are different from each other. Economics PhDs are different, but there's still more of a core central paradigm that everybody learns through every PhD program. And that's just not necessarily true in strategy.
Yeah, it's true. Say finance within a business school.
Finance would be another great example, right? Yeah.
Right. I came, obviously partly out of economics. And, if you look at the way economics departments are staffed, there are these specializations, macro, micro, labor, so on.
Development. Yeah.
Right. And so every department has got at least one person doing those things. And in finance, it's in some ways similar, but in strategy, it's not similar at all. I mean,
right. Finance groups will have their asset pricing person, their corporate governance person, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, right. Strategy groups tend to be, these enclaves of similarity, right? Yeah.
So I think for a doctoral student who's on the job market, it's really imperative to take a look, as you say, at the school and see, are there concentrations of people focused on particular issues, particular topics, and make sure you're aware of that and ideally able to connect your research to what they are doing.
Exactly. Exactly.
because, I mean, every school is different. It's also, I think, both a problem and an opportunity for the strategy field. One reason I like strategy is because it is so open-ended. I mean, I've always been, curious about phenomena relating to business. And so it means that you can, you find something that is interesting and it probably fits within strategy. I mean, if you look at my own research, it's really quite unfocused in many ways. And I've worked on lots and lots of different topics. I mean, I'm not sure that necessarily was the best strategy, but it's kept, it's meant that as I've, gone through the field, I've been able to find topics that come up that are interesting to me, that can be explored, and so you don't get stale.
Right, right. So the second thing that I wanted to mention that I that I liked in your answer was when you were talking about the stumbling onto the learning curve aspect of the data, right? I think the important lesson there for doctoral students is to be open to what the data is saying, not to, I mean, we have and we should have hypotheses and priors about what things are going to look like in the data, and and we do collect data presumably with the idea of testing those hypotheses, testing those priors, and that's proper procedure. But I think a lot of this field runs on serendipity, and we have to be open to not just what we think is going to be happening in the data, but what the data itself actually tells us. I think that's a great example.
Yeah, I mean, there've been a number of situations I've been in where, I've been planning to do X, but you look at the data and you say, wow, the data is really telling us why, and that's really quite interesting. Well, the paper that I decided not to present at Purdue is with one of my doctoral students who came across a phenomenon that is just so incredibly striking empirically. I said, this is really crying out for us to explain why we see this. So it's now a joint paper, and I've been working closely with her on it. And it's, that paper is probably not so central to my work, and maybe not even, fundamental in the strategy field, but it's a really interesting phenomenon. I do think that the strategy field has always been phenomenon driven. And, the question is for a doctoral student, how do you find dissertation topics, and how do you, as I indicated, sort of pivot? Very often people will start by being interested in a phenomenon and then looking at the theory, and then say, oh, there's a little gap in the theory here that I can fill, and I'll collect some data. Mm-hmm. But as I suggested, maybe you collect the data and you discover, well, there are other things that you're seeing that are much more interesting than that little gap that you're planning to fill.
Right, and that's a good lesson for the students to learn. Probably sometimes a good lesson for me to learn too. And that actually comes up also in theoretical work too. It's not necessarily just an empirical work. If I'm doing a formal model and I include a set of parameters, and I was just kind of interested in this one parameter, but it turns out some other parameter has a more interesting effect, I've got to be open to that possibility. So let me flip the question around though. So I had asked you what's the most important piece of advice that you give to doctoral students, but what has been the most important piece of advice that you have received in the course of your career, either as a doctoral student or later?
That's a good question. Well, I did in that other interview talk about Herb Simon, when he told me I should become an economist rather than a physicist or engineer. That was probably the one piece of advice that changed my course more than any other
Certainly
No.
the most consequential piece of advice, yes.
Right. I mean, I mean, he sensed that I was on this, in moving in this direction anyway. So advice that I've received.
Perhaps during the doctoral program, or perhaps while you were on the tenure track.
Yeah, I would. Well, there's advice about your professional work, research, and there's also career advice.
I'll take anything.
So I would say, just to answer your question a little bit indirectly, again, sort of focusing on doctoral students and the doctoral program. I mean, I had a fantastic committee. I mean, I had, Mike Porter, Mike Spence, future Nobel Prize winner, Dick Caves, and they gave me, in three very different ways, excellent advice on my research and thinking about issues. And I mean, to this day, I think the question in one of my PhD exams that I essentially failed, that I was unable to answer in a general way, I always keep thinking about this question. So that has been, that sort of shaping and just a lot of these interactions were really very helpful in ways that it's hard for me to pin down just any particular specific bit of advice. But another feature was that this was a committee that wasn't going to give me career advice just by their nature, and I wasn't going to go back and ask them. I mean, you don't go back to Mike Spence after he won the Nobel Prize. I wasn't going to ask him nitty gritty questions about how I should write this essay or for promotion or what have you. So I would say that I looking back, didn't actually have a mentor when I started in the early part of my career. There was nobody at Stanford who was really doing anything like what I was doing. And I didn't have this committee that I could just go back to. Like some of my students today will come back to me with, I've got this, I'm up for promotion, I've got to write this essay on, on my research. And that's, I feel like, something I can really be very helpful about. Because when you've been through this process and then you're on the other side, you understand how it works. But in my own case, when I was up for promotion at Stanford, I didn't understand that this essay, this research statement, really mattered, especially in my case, because I had published one paper, which wasn't very much at that time, and I had all these working papers. I had 7 or 8. That were in fairly advanced stages. And what I didn't understand was it was really critical for me to explain how all this work fit together and what the trajectory was and so on. And I just didn't get it. I spent, an afternoon, putting together a little thing that made sense to me. I never showed it to anybody. Admitted it was terrible. I mean, it was, if you, partly as, I think probably largely as a result, my review didn't go very well. Within months of this review, I actually published 6 of these papers, came out in but by that time,
how you like me now?
right, but by that time, see, the damage was done. I mean, it was my own naivete. I guess the point I'm making on the career development side is that that kind of advice really is important.
Yeah.
We now, remember, I started in the very early days of the strategy field. I mean, today we have lots of institutions that provide people with advice. The academy and so on. There are special, ways that you can meet with, junior faculty meet with senior faculty, doctoral students meet with senior faculty. And in that sort of informal context, you can get a lot of advice.
Right.
and you can get contacts with people who will give you comments and so on. And I think that's all very valuable. And I think for those of us who are more senior, it's really an important part of our responsibility. So I would just, sort of turn around your question to say that this is something that we now do a better job of in general.
Right.
And it's really important on both sides, both as a faculty member to advise your students and other students, and also for students to reach out, to not be reluctant. I mean, what I really should have done is I should have, shown this statement to either my old committee or, some of the faculty, or even, just people I knew, to make sure that somebody other than me could understand what I was trying to say.
Right. Yep. So yeah, situations where we could use some good advice. Absolutely. And I don't know, you might be aware of this, but I actually have a video on YouTube on the specific issue of reverse engineering a successful tenure review. And it's gotten over 2,000 views by this point. I don't know if you had a chance to watch it, but it does deal directly with those issues.
Right. I did watch some of it, but since I'm now past that stage, I just
well, when you have those past students who come back to you saying, I need some help because I'm coming up for review, maybe point them to my channel.
Right. And there's now, right, there is also, as you say, there's what you've created, and even others, have some of these materials out there. So it's
Absolutely.
I mean, the field has really changed a lot since when I was, first entering it.
Right. So I wanted to talk with you about the value creation and appropriation stream of research, the VCA research that you've been doing. I think, in your interview with Heather, you very adequately covered the early work that you had done on entry order and market entry. But I wanted to follow up with this more recent stream of research that you've been working on, because I don't know about you, but I believe that this has the potential to be your biggest legacy, even a bigger legacy than the first mover advantage work that you've done. I kind of want to ask you a little bit about where this came from, because I think we can all agree that the issue of value creation and appropriation is a central issue for the field, but it's also an issue where the theory has gotten far ahead of the empirics. There's a few notable exceptions to that, where a few people have been doing good empirical work, trying to nail down the relationship between value creation and value appropriation. I think particularly maybe one of the pioneers in that area was Matt Grennan with his dissertation on medical device sales, where he shows, for some reason or other, there is a huge gap, a huge range of prices that are open for negotiation in that industry. Not quite sure why, but he did I think a very good job in kind of taking the theory of the relationship between value creation and value appropriation to some actual data. So tell us maybe a little bit about where your thinking on this issue came from. I remember back in 2009, you were the featured keynote speaker at the Atlanta Competitive Advantage Conference. And I remember you talking during that presentation about kind of an early version of your ideas on this topic. So maybe tell us a little bit about, what was on your mind then, and how has it evolved over the preceding, what is it now, 12 years since then?
Sure. And I want to thank you. You were one of the editors of the special issue of SMJ, where one of these articles appeared.
Well, you had a series of 3 articles, I believe, right? Co-authored with Roberto Garcia Castro and my friend Natarajan Balasubramanian, as well as your paper in Strategic Management Review, which I think is, I don't know, my opinion, one man's opinion, probably the best paper that young journal has published yet so far. Yeah, so you've done a lot of work. So tell us a little bit about, where did this come from? Obviously, you're trying to combine both the theoretical side with the issues of methodology and empirics, right? And so you clearly are thinking along those two tracks and trying to combine those two sides. Tell us a little bit about how your thinking developed on both sides and how you've worked to combine them.
Right, and let me just mention, you said that the ACAC presentation I gave in 2009, I mean, that was actually not so early in the development of
Right.
ideas. But if that presentation had two pieces, one was kind of a theoretical part, which turned into that strategic management review article.
I remember that.
The other
Yes.
was the empirical part that I presented, which turned into the SMJ articles, the empirical articles. But going back, where did this idea come from? So we're basically using a methodology from economics, which is surprisingly not so well known. One piece of it is the total factor productivity formula, which a lot of people know, and the other is the dual to it, which is, well, anyway, I am going to give, for your group, a seminar sort of covering a lot of these issues. But I learned of this from Arnold Harberger, Al Harberger. Those of you who have an economics background may remember Harberger triangles. There's, when you do the little
welfare triangles.
Triangles, right? Harberger is the one that showed that triangle is, in the scheme of things, relatively small.
Right.
So Harberger, who's done sort of development-oriented work, among other things, had doctoral students at UCLA who were basically doing extensions of his work. And at that time at UCLA, you had to have someone on PhD committees who came from another department. That's now been abandoned, which I think is a bad idea, but it meant that I was on committees over in the economics department, and Harberger had me at least twice on his students' committees. And so I could see how he was applying this, and the students were applying this at the industry level. And it seemed to me that we could do this at the firm level. So actually, when Natarajan, who's now full professor, was my student, we were first working on this. So I can't remember quite how far back that goes, but like a couple decades. So, and so we were fiddling with this, and I had some data on the auto industry, and it was, I mean, looking backwards, it all seems very clear to me now, but at the time it was hard to know exactly how to apply this. In fact, Harberger later told me that he didn't think it could be applied at the firm level, but was very pleased to see from our work that it could be, at least in some contexts. I mean, there are a fair number of caveats here. So Natarajan and I worked on this. In fact, we gave a version of our paper at that ACAC conference before 2009, I believe it was. And we submitted it to the SMJ, and we got back, it was reject and resubmit. And basically the concern was that this was a formula that people might think you could just plug in, just get data from company annual reports, plug in the numbers and, boom. I mean, you've got really good, valid, calculations. And the reviewer thought that was not likely to be true in many cases, maybe even most cases. And so you should be really careful. So this made me realize that we really did need to be very careful about this. And so we spent a lot of time, trying to really work out and understand this model and how it can be applied. Roberto Garcia Castro came in. Roberto, saw, the value of this. He also saw that the airline industry was a great context in which to apply it. Roberto, the first paper that appeared, Roberto asked me, did I want to be co-author on this purely theoretical paper. And I said, Roberto, I really think this is empirical technique and we should focus on the empirical side. And he said, well, what if I asked Ruth Aguilera to co-author with me? I said, fine. So that paper appeared in SMJ with Roberto, as the lead author there. So that put the technique out there in theory. And then actually looking at the dates, it wasn't until a few years later that we really got the data together with the model. And we're able to show, I think, quite effectively in the airline industry how you could work through this model.
When was that first paper with Roberto? I can't remember.
I think it was 2014.
Okay.
So, the ACAC presentation was 2009, that was 2014. Our empirical papers come out in 2017, 2018. So I think, so anyway, advice to a junior faculty member or doctoral student, this is something that I, at the time early on, there were a number of projects after I got tenure that I spent time on that I think it looked like I wasn't publishing much because I was trying to do these new things and they just weren't getting published. And some of them, quite frankly, I eventually dropped. But in some of them, I'm trying to actually finish up now. There's still
right.
Good reasons.
And by the way, I experienced a similar kind of mid-career lull myself, not because I wasn't working hard. I was working my butt off trying to get research done, but it just wasn't connecting.
Right. And it doesn't, I don't know about Purdue, but UCLA, the way the promotions process works is you actually go up for review every 2 or 3 years. And so it rewards somebody who's doing kind of incremental work and things are coming out, bit by bit. And so every 3 years, you've got another, couple of papers and so on. If you're trying to, reboot in some areas and aren't so worried about an incremental contribution, although, ultimately, a lot of the things we do turn out to be pretty incremental. It's, I think it's not always the best career strategy, as opposed to being very focused in an area and just, you're working with students, things are coming out. And ultimately that strategy, if it's successful, you end up being the master of the universe in that particular area. And a lot of people have very successful careers of that sort. I've just, as I said, I've just been curious about a lot of different things. Early on, Jim March tried to convince me that I should focus on organizational learning because I had, just work on the learning curves. I decided no, that I wasn't, I wasn't so curious. Organizational learning is a very broad name.
Learning wasn't what motivated you to get into that chemical industry study in the first place, right? It was something serendipitous that dropped out of the study.
Right, exactly. So, but others, as I mentioned, Dan Leventhal, Linda Argoti have had very successful careers, focusing a lot on organizational learning related issues. So I think there are, I'm departing from your specific question about this line of research and commenting more generally about career trajectories, but they are pretty diverse. So anyway, back to the VCA model, as Roberto called it. I actually think that it's very powerful as a way, in the right context, empirically, it can be very effective. And I'll talk more in the seminar about ways to use it, even to do hypothesis testing and so on. It keeps you honest. So first of all, it provides a way to empirically look at these stakeholder issues that generally has not been done. The second is it keeps you honest in terms of understanding there's no free lunch here. that you've got it, there's the value created has got to be equal to the value distributed.
Mhm.
And there are various ways that I think that the work we've been doing can be extended, but I think the greatest challenge, not just for this research, but I think for the field in general, one of the great challenges is to think more broadly about value creation. We've got all this work on ESG metrics. We've got externalities which are not in the model that we use at all. And so at this point, to get firms to do the right thing, in some sense, as can we actually create metrics that let us think about value creation and distribution in this very broad way that includes the environmental and social elements, and then figure out ways to sort of engineer with these metrics ways to incentivize CEOs and other managers to pay more attention to these things that might initially seem to be outside of shareholder gain, but if the right incentives are put in place, maybe shareholder gain long term is the same thing as maximizing all these other value creation elements. Porter has this idea of shared value, which kind of gets at that idea a little bit. It's always been a little unclear to me exactly what we mean by shared value, but the general idea that we want to somehow get these other stakeholder benefits and externalities into the incentive set for top managers, maybe by making these empirically this value or cost, if it's pollution, or visible through a set of metrics. And then the CEOs are just competing, on these metrics. They want to, because these lists are publicized and we can actually agree on the metrics. A lot of companies don't want to be at the bottom of the list; they want to be at the top. And so maybe without using regulation, we could get some of these positive outcomes in terms of value creation. So that's going well beyond the existing state of the VCA model. Right. But I do think it's, if you think about the challenges for strategy in general, that's one of the big ones out there that I think applies today.
Nice. So I remember, okay, so you said at the beginning when I asked you about VCA that you were, that the automobile industry was played a central role in helping you to develop those ideas. And I do remember that, even long before the ACAC presentation, you had that paper in management science with Rajiv Dhawan on the automobile industry. Was that work in some sense a precursor to this work that you've developed on VCA?
Well, that work is different. That was sort of using this stochastic frontier model.
Stochastic frontiers, yeah, right.
Which we kind of, I spun it into a value creation, issue. I mean, some of that, the auto industry had intrigued me. I mean, I went from chemicals to autos in terms of data collection, partly because I was, when I started my career, as I mentioned at Stanford, I was actually teaching operations management, and the Japanese.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I would not recommend to people that they
switching fields early in your career.
Right. I mean, if things had been different, I could be an operations scholar today. In fact, I thought at that time it seemed to me that operations had no empirical component, which was true. You had people who were coming out of operations research who were, basically doing, modeling, and then you had people coming from a much more applied approach, basically case-based approach, essentially. They didn't really talk to each other, and it seemed to me that, operations would benefit from some more empirically based research. But and that's actually happened in the operations field. I mean, today it's really a very healthy development. And I think there really are quite a few overlaps with strategy, which a lot of people don't see because they haven't been trained on the operations side. But I was just too early. I mean, I was doing this. I even remember submitting a paper to an operations journal. Your own now emeritus faculty member Leroy Schwartz at Purdue was the editor, and the review came back. You know, why are you doing this? Why are you testing these models empirically?
Obviously true, because
right.
QED, right? We derive the result QED.
Right. If the math is right, the model is right. And there was no sense at that time that maybe if we have different models with different predictions, maybe they apply more in some contexts than in others, and we'd like to figure out some sort of mapping or something like that sort, which I think the operations field is now really embraced. So it's been really gratifying to see the operations move in that direction. But I mean, it was very quickly clear that I shouldn't do this, because it's, you know, as a junior faculty member, you know, I was not, you know, there wasn't much support for it at that time. Whereas somebody in operations now, I think it would be a great thing to do. So I started collecting this data on autos largely I had a set of studies that really relate to this question of Japanese, you know, why, you know, Japanese production methods and inventory reduction, Toyota production system, so on. And so that management science paper was really focused on that set of questions. And then because I had the auto data, again, you know, sort of leveraging what you have, which, you know, obviously a lot of us do, I said, okay, we can use that auto data to look at this value creation distribution thing. And it was okay. But when Roberto came along and showed that the airline industry, you know, was just a much better context for doing this, I said, okay, well, you know, we can maybe publish this on autos, but really the airline industry is the sandbox where we should really do our additional development.
Right, right. That makes sense. So I'm not going to get into the weeds of the method itself, but just maybe curious if you have a strategy, since we're in the strategy field, for getting this methodology diffused to researchers for the future. Is there, you know, will you and Roberto and Natarajan be developing VCA workshops or doctoral trainings for VCA or VCA conferences or anything like that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we have plans to do this now, but maybe it would be a good idea. I think that the papers tend not to be, certainly not cited as much as I thought they would be. Mm-hmm. Partly maybe they're a little bit complicated in some ways. And as I indicated before, I'm a little bit torn. On one side, I think this is one of the best things that I've done with the greatest potential for the future. On the other hand, I agree. It has the greatest potential for misuse and harm. Right. You know, as I indicated with that early review. And so you know, the question here is how do we sort of thread that needle, sort of keep things developing in a productive way, as opposed to, you know, I don't want people again to just say, oh, here's a formula, we can just get CompuStat data, a couple of deflators, plug in. But it can be, you know, it can be very applicable. There's a study, again, in the SMJ, that applies this to European telecommunications.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. So it's, you know, there are multiple contexts where it can be done. And I mean, even some of the people working kind of in the ESG area have said, hey, this is, you know, seems like a great framework. And I've again, I'm a little hesitant to say literally you can apply this formula, but I do think one of the greatest benefits is it makes you think very carefully about what really is going on here. I mean, in terms of, exactly where is the value creation coming from, and where is it going to? I mean, there's by definition, you can't have, you can't distribute more than you're generating.
Right. The feasibility constraint.
Right. Right. So anyway, I thank you for the encouragement, and
we'll work on a methodology diffusion plan, perhaps, to strategize that. Well, I do need to kind of move on because we are getting close to the time allocated for this. Let me just ask a couple of last questions. So your two main research areas, broadly defined, if I can say so, are number one, market entry, and number two, measuring and explaining interfirm differences in productivity and performance.
Right. Yeah.
Broadly, yeah. So for each of those two research areas, what do you think are the biggest unanswered questions, the most important unanswered questions? What do we not know about those two topics that we really ought to know by now? What do we not know about market entry that we really ought to know by now? Or what do we not know about interfirm measuring and explaining interfirm differences in performance and productivity that we really ought to know by now?
Well, on the latter, and we've just been talking about the VCA, and so I would say there it's to really come up with an empirical approach that is both ideally broad and precise. Now on the entry side, I think one of the biggest opportunities there really relates to thinking about entry under uncertainty, which is almost by definition all entry is done under uncertainty.
Right.
And I think there's an opportunity to sort of unify the field in some ways. Combining, I mean, we now know a lot about real options, which is kind of the theory. When I was in graduate school, we were just beginning to figure this out. I mean, I was amazed, with these NPV calculations of projects, that if there was information revealed at some point and you could respond to that,
completely
changes everything, right? And now we know how to deal with that. And there's work, if you think about startups, which is market entry.
Right.
At the most micro level, we've got sort of A/B testing. At the more macro level, we've got pivoting. We've got just in general this question of how, if you're a startup entering a new business, how do you approach the question of uncertainty? There's sort of commitment versus flexibility ideas that Emawad promoted. We've got Elizabeth Holmes right now on trial.
Yes.
Because
a lot of uncertainty.
A lot of it. She failed in her ability to deal with uncertainty, essentially. So this is a market entrant who's now a really sad case where she, like many entrepreneurs and even established firms, there's a tendency to try to brush away the uncertainty. Just say, oh yeah, we're committed.
We'll make it happen.
We'll make it happen, right? And we see how much trouble you get into there from her example, and really many others. In big companies, they have a lot of trouble with market entry, entering new businesses, and dealing with uncertainty, because either we're gonna make a plan, we're gonna do this. But I do think today we've got this extraordinary example of Amazon. I mean, there's never been a large company that has succeeded with market entry in a way that Amazon has. I mean, Amazon's able to operate like this little entrepreneurial company. And it's, I think, because Jeff Bezos—
I'll point out one thing about Amazon. They don't care about profits. They never have.
Well, in short term.
Right, short term, true, but the short term has stretched out into what, 3 decades now, and
Right.
they're still generating all their profits at this point out of web services.
Right.
The rest of their businesses are operating at losses or break even at best.
Right, which was, yeah, I mean, talk about serendipity, but they recognize this. There's a big learning curve effect. They were able to keep it secret, and there was stealth. I mean, they were able to grow AWS and tremendously.
Right.
They understood this. You could call it a growth option in some sense. Well, sort of initially unexpected, but Bezos. I think he's figured out, at least in the context of the culture he's created, how to run a big company that is able to experiment with market entry. Again, they at this point, some of them have failed. I mean, their initial phone was a huge failure.
Right.
The jury is out on a lot of these other entries, but he's got this metaphor of one-way and two-way doors, which is basically, the option to abandon, and how do you actually communicate this to a large audience internally in the company? We want to structure things again based on information. If we get information, can we go back out the door, basically abandon the project as opposed to commit? Yeah. So I mean, Whole Foods was a commitment. We'll see if that actually works out for them. But they've had a lot of things that they've been able to, go through two-way doors and either back out or use the growth option if it turns out to be working well.
Last question, because I know Luis's head is going to explode if I don't get moving on soon. But last question. So you graduated in 1982. So you've been in this, pardon?
PhD.
PhD. You graduated with a PhD in 1982. So you have been in this field, roughly speaking, about 40 years. So number one, how has the field changed over that time? How has the field of strategy changed over 40 years in your observation? And number two, how do you expect the field of strategy to change over the next 40 years? What do you think the field of strategy will look like in 40 years?
And you want me to answer these both in 1 minute? Is that?
Oh, sure. I know you can. You're brilliant.
No, so the strategy field has changed enormously, of course, and for the better. So you're at Purdue. I mean, Dan Chendel, pioneered this, way back when,
Right.
And it started off. Basically, the SMJ was Dan's thing, and the papers piled up on their kitchen table, and it was a very different sort of operation from what we have today. So the field has grown in, I mean, we now cover all these topics. I mean, one challenge is I think that breadth is a good thing, but trying to sort of keep it, sort of make it clear that it is a coherent field and that things connect. That's actually one of the challenges that I'm trying to figure out as the media innovations editor. Can we actually, make the structure clearer to people? So it's, we've got, I mean, so we've grown in terms of, there are lots of ideas out there, lots of subfields. I think there is an issue in strategy, comparing the early days, like when I came out, Mike Porter had just published his first book.
Right.
And so this, the strategy field, although it was emerging, it was very amorphous. And I think in the early days, Porter had the effect of saying, okay, people focused in on Porter's ideas. The 5 forces, which is still with us today. I mean, this is sort of, and it may be too much with us today, in that I do think that there are other things, like, as I was suggesting, uncertainty. So, should the field be the five forces, or should it be strategic management of uncertainty? I mean, I think the latter really has, because it's intellectually interesting and challenging, but also, managerially incredibly relevant. Managers are always faced with the question of how do you make decisions under uncertainty? Elizabeth Holmes did it poorly. Other people often do it poorly. Bezos, we could argue, how well they've done. So I do think that the field is in some need of kind of a reboot around ideas. We have the RBB, which is kind of a foundational structure now for a lot of things. But I do, and again, these ideas about, I've been discussing about value creation and distribution. I think those are really fundamental questions. So, I really can't predict where the field is going, but I think we do have the seeds now for a new sort of generation. I mean, those of you, at some point I'm going to retire, so I can carry some of this forward a little bit, but it's really those of you who are out there who have the opportunity to take the strategy field to this next level. I think strategy in general has succeeded well beyond Dan Chandel's dreams. But anyway, there are these challenges and opportunities that we have to solidify the field and to provide new set of foundations in the future.
I certainly don't think Dan envisioned the day that would ever come that, SMJ would receive 2,000 submissions a year or anything like that, so I think that you're definitely right about that. Well, everybody, please join me in thanking Marvin for an outstanding interview. Really appreciate your willingness to sit for our little celebrity talk show ritual. Thanks very much.
No, thank you. It was a real pleasure. And again, thanks for running this whole sequence that you've got out there.